Okay, Gabby Marshall, A2PE, E&A.
I watched the goal attack, and out of the performance pyramid, there's 4 stages to the performance pyramid. It's foundation, participation, performance and excellence. And I'd say that she's in the performance stage of the pyramid because she's very committed to a sport. Obviously she trains quite regularly and she's exceeded. Must have probably started out playing school netball, which would be in the participation stage, but she's moved on to playing club netball, and the emphasis is more on winning rather than just participation, taking part, and she'll be sort of performing at a regional level. The way the national and governing body, which is England Netball, the way that will have helped to get to this stage is, for example, they start off playing high five, which is a modified version of netball, where you have just 5 players instead of 7, and there's a rotation system in place where you rotate through all the positions whilst you're playing, just so you can get a feel of each position and just to obviously develop your basic skills. Then she could have gone on to play school netball, which is sort of low level, but again just emphasis on building skills. Then she may have gone on to county, which has 2 platforms. It has satellite county, which is sort of the first progression from school, and then there's the actual county academies, which will probably train maybe fortnightly, monthly. Again, that'd be more on, instead of just learning skills, that might be where you become to sort of focusing on winning, and then progressing from there to regional netball. So obviously around here you go to the North West Netball Association and have trials to get into that, and then from there you can eventually get onto the game that we watched. It was NPL, so that's a under-19s competition in which you'd have to trial to get into. So again, that further emphasises the fact that she's on the performance stage of the pyramid, because it's, like I say, emphasis is on the winning. Sport England has done a lot for netball recently. Sport England aims to, within netball, it'll aim to improve high performance netball and talent development. So out of the 25 million that it funded England Netball with, 5 million of that has gone on to high performance and 3.5 million has gone on to talent development. So again, that'll just further this player's progression if she wants to climb up the netballing ladder, so to say. Strengths and weaknesses, the skills that she showed. So she had quite good catching ability. This is because she kept her eyes focused on the ball. She extended her arms into a W sort of formation, and she maintained eye contact with the ball while it's moving, which is very important, because the second you take your eye off the ball, you obviously might get hit in the face with the ball. The athlete who's catching the ball, she needs to be able to selectively attend on environmental cues. So this involves cue utilisation, which is a process that facilitates maximal attention control to allow efficient decision making. And the cue utilisation hypothesis states that if the player had low arousal, they would have a wide perceptual field, and if they had high arousal, they'd have a narrow perceptual field. So if they had a wide perceptual field, that would mean that they'd have they wouldn't be able to selectively attend on one cue. They'd have lots of different cues. So for example, they might see the coach stood on the sideline and the umpire and all the other players on the court, and they might not be able to just selectively focus on the ball itself and the trajectory of the pass. Whereas if they had high arousal, which would be narrow perceptual field, it'd mean that they'd miss certain cues. For example, the speed of the ball coming in, they might not time not only their movement but when they extend their arms, which would mean that they'd drop the ball, and that could lead to hypervigilance. Whereas optimal arousal is obviously the state where the performer wants to be, being able to catch the ball and focus just on the exact cues that it wants to. Another strength of the performer was their footwork. They landed 1-2, which means that they wouldn't get pulled by the umpire because they didn't move the landing foot. And they also used appropriate footwork depending on the situation, because in netball you can do different types of footwork. For example, you can do a 1 count, which is where you do a quick release, just land literally on 1 foot, and instead of placing your second foot down, you just land on the 1 foot and offload the ball as quickly as possible. So for example, if the defender wasn't in position, she knew to use this type of footwork to gain an advantage. Or she could use running footwork, so if she was going at high speed, she'd use running footwork, which means she'd transfer her weight fully as she was driving onto the ball, again just to get ahead of her opponent. This skill may have been reinforced through positive reinforcement via the coach that she might have had, as I mentioned, through the different stages. They might have given her feedback saying like, well done, you've just done that correctly. And this feedback would help improve the player's confidence and motivation. And this is if the performer is, it's quite useful if the performer is at a cognitive or associative stage. Another thing that you could link into footwork is osteoarthritis. Since netball is a very high impact sport, there's lots of landing and changing direction. Players, if they play for a long time, they could be prone to osteoarthritis, which is where the person loses or it's like gradual degeneration of the articular cartilage, and it's quite prominent at the end of long bones, which are quite weight-bearing bones, such as the femur, which would lead to osteoarthritis in the knee, or for example your hips, because they bear quite a lot of the weight. So this could, although she's doing the footwork correctly, it might be something that could happen in the future due to, as I say, a lot of high impact. Shooting was a good skill because she was very accurate. I think in the clip I only saw her miss maybe 1 shot, so obviously that's positive. She extends fully onto her toes and flicks her wrist and follows through as she releases the ball, which means that she gets backspin on the ball. So if there is any chance that the ball might have been, say, a centimetre or too far, too close to the post, then the backspin should hopefully help spin the ball into her favour and put it into the back of the net. Another weakness of her skills was her shoulder passing. Her release point was quite low, so normally when you're doing a shoulder pass you should lift your elbow up away from your body in order to get the right power onto the ball, but she didn't transfer her weight properly and she didn't lift her elbow high, which meant there was quite a lack of power on the ball, which meant it often either got intercepted or didn't make it to the intended player. Alright, I'm going on this. Chest pass release point on her skills was also a weakness, because when she did a chest pass, she often released it from quite low. She dropped the ball down instead of holding it up sort of like just below her neck. She'd often dropped it down, which meant the defender, if they were doing a stage 2 defence, which means that if the defender had their arms up over the ball, say on a 3-foot mark, the chest pass could be easily intercepted by the defender. And it also means that it's got not the best trajectory of the pass, because the ball would rise upwards because it's being released from a low point, which again gives the defender more chance to intercept the pass. The strength of her tactics were that on a centre pass attack she used good variety of methods of getting free. So she either did a dodge or a fake one way, like dropped her shoulder, and her and her wing attack had obviously worked on a strategy where only one player would go over the line. This is a good strategy to have, because then on the second phase of the play, so once the ball's been passed from the centre once they've received the first pass, it means that the player who didn't receive the ball could drive deep for second phase, which gives them an advantage when attacking because they've gained possession on the opponent. the fact that she was quick over the line means that she might have had a fast reaction time to respond to the whistle. Reaction time is when you add reaction time plus movement time equals your response time. So this means that the reaction time would be the time taken for the player to respond to, in this case it would be the whistle. And then the movement time would be how long it takes for the player to, once they've reacted to the whistle, to move over the third line to receive the ball. And the total of this time would equal the response time. This particular example would be a choice reaction time because there are several stimuli. For example, although she is just responding to the whistle, there's also the ball that she needs to consider and the defender, and there could be several different outcomes. And Hicks' law states that the more stimuli present, the longer it takes for the player to choose the correct response and process info. So the fact that the player has got a quick reaction time means that she obviously has very good information processing, and she's quite quick at doing that, which I think is a positive. Another thing she was good at is her court balance. So she ran into space, but she didn't run into other people's space so she didn't limit other people's opportunities. And she also gained quite a lot of depth whilst attacking and penetrated into the space. For example, as I mentioned on the second phase, she penetrated deep down into the ball to gain possession on the opponent. One of her weaknesses tactically was when she did shoot. Although I did mention that she was quite accurate, she wasn't the best at positioning herself in order to gain rebounds. So on the one shot that she did miss, or the two shots that she did miss, she didn't position herself accordingly after the shot in front of the defender to help maximise her chances of getting the rebound. Fleischmann identified two types of ability. There's gross motor and psychomotor ability. So when rebounding, gross motor ability would come into play because it involves movement and physical fitness such as explosive strength whilst jumping up to get the ball, and it also involves psychomotor ability because you have to process information, and it involves decision making and perceptions such as reaction time. As I mentioned earlier, she'd have to react to the stimulus of the ball hitting the ring and be able to jump up obviously as quickly as possible. Another tactical weakness was her centre pass defence. Although she is a goal attack, which means on the opposition centre passes they wouldn't particularly want to go back to her goal defence, but at the same time when the other team did have a centre pass, she was never really set up and she wasn't really marking her player well, which means that if they did want to go back they could have done quite easily. I think this could be linked to one of her fitness weaknesses, which is her endurance, because she, as I say, she lacked defensive effort quite a lot, and when she was attacking she didn't drive fully onto the ball, which means that the defender did have chance to come in and intercept if they felt like it and if they obviously wanted to. The endurance is linked to the aerobic system, which is predominantly used in netball. It has 3 stages: glycolysis, which is in the muscle sarcoplasm and it produces 2 ATP, Krebs cycle, which is in the mitochondrial matrix and it also produces 2 ATP, and the electron transfer chain, which is in the mitochondria cristae and that produces 34 ATP. So that's a total of 38 ATP. However, some of her strengths of her fitness was her agility. She had a good change of direction, which meant she could beat a defender, and she used different methods of getting through. So for example, if she saw space at the back, she'd back up the defender, which means she'd run behind them and use her body sort of to get ahead, her shoulder ahead at the back of the defender and drive into the back space. Or she'd also, on the other hand, do a front cut, which meant she'd cut in front of a defender, again using that agility and change of direction to beat the defender. And she also used use dodges and double dodges. By dodging, the opponent has to anticipate which way you're going to go, and they begin to process information based on the stimulus that you provide them, which is the first movement of your dodge, like the first direction which you go in. But when you set off in another direction, your opponent must finish processing the first stimulus before being able to process the second stimulus of you actually changing direction. This is referred to as the psychological refractory period, and that allows her to gain an advantage on her opponent because they cannot deal with her second movement before they've dealt with the first, and that gives her a fraction of a second to beat a defender and get ahead of them. Another strength was her explosive strength of a fitness component. This has shown the fact that she had a good vertical jump. So, for example, when she was trying to get the ball, her feeders could place the ball quite significantly above her, and she would be able to jump and gain the ball. Explosive strength is the ability to expand a maximum amount of energy in one or a series of sudden high-intensity movements, and the player may have increased their explosive strength through the use of plyometrics. For example, this is where you do hops, jumps and bounds, so different jumps, things like that. And it involves placing an eccentric stretch on a muscle to initiate the stretch reflex. So it increases the muscle fibres and motor units, and this in turn increases the contraction forces of the muscle. Her main weakness was her shoulder pass, and that is the one that I'm going to focus on in my action plan. This was because, as I say, her shoulder pass wasn't very accurate, and while she did the pass, she didn't abduct her shoulder fully away from her body, and while she did it, she didn't extend she didn't flex her elbow, which meant that she couldn't generate a lot of power and she couldn't direct the pass exactly to where she wanted to. This could have been a result of a follow through. So while she transferred her weight, she didn't completely follow through and flick her wrist and extend her elbow, which results in the pass going wayward. My action plan the shoulder has a rotator cuff, which consists of the supraspinatus, the infraspinatus, the teres minor and the subscapularis. This is because the humerus fits into a shallow cavity in the scapula, which means that it is quite prone to dislocation, and although it has quite a large range of motion, it needs something to stabilise it to avoid injury. My action plan would last I'd do it 2 times a week for 7 weeks, and I'd do 30-minute sessions, not including the warm-up. The warm-up is important because it increases muscle temperature and it increases the elasticity of the muscles, which reduces the risk of injury, and it also increases the oxygen dissertation and nerve contraction, which increases the performer's reaction times, which would be useful whilst obviously working on this. To test my performer's accuracy, I would film her playing in a match, and I'd calculate the percentage of inaccurate shoulder passes, and by the end of the plan I'd want her to improve by at least 15% accuracy. The reason that I'm filming is because some people suffer from evaluation apprehension, and I wouldn't obviously I'd gain consent first, but I wouldn't let the person know when I was filming them, so that if she suffered from social inhibition or social facilitation, either way it wouldn't affect her score. that she got. My first progressive practice would be wall taps. So this is just the person getting comfortable using the ball on one hand, just tapping the ball using a wrist on the wall, doing both right and left hand. Then you could do it in a clock formation, so sort of bringing the ball above her head, just tapping it around sort of like that in a clock. And then you could do just jump release, so this is quite close to the wall, sort of like 3 foot away from the wall, jump release, just powering through. This is sort of the first practice, just to get her hands working and get her comfortable with the ball in one hand. Then I'd do accuracy of the pass onto a cross on the wall. This would initially be without pressure, so she could increase the distances, say 5 metres to begin with, then 10 metres, nothing more than that really. And again, without pressure, just trying to reinforce the coaching points that she needs to follow through and extend her elbow and make sure she tries to get them as accurate as possible. I do this again, but with movement, so the player would move, someone would obviously have to pass her the ball and she'd move towards or away from the wall to make sure that she's fatigued, so it stimulates it more in a match condition. But again, this would be without a defender. And then as she becomes more comfortable and can become more accurate, I'd progress that to having a 3 foot mark, which is a second stage of defence in netball, just to put her under more pressure and to see if she can get the ball around the defender onto the wall. Then I'd progress onto a moving target, for example a split lead drill where you're in a queue and 2 people drive out. The one that receives the ball then has to pass to the other player that drove out, who's changed direction and is driving on an angle. This obviously makes it more game realistic, as they have to hit a moving player, and then to further increase the game realisticness, I would add a first stage defender, so that's just on the person who's throwing the ball, and then I'd add a second stage defender, which is on the player that's moving. And then lastly, the final practice would be a 5 versus 5 game, which would consist in 2/3 of the court, and they're just passing the ball around each other. Obviously it brings in a lot of game principles such as defending, but the main point of the game is that you gain 1 point for every successful shoulder pass to a player who's running through a gate, which could be like 2 cones sort of together, and if they hit a player, like if the player catches the ball running through the gate, then they get a point. Throughout the 7-week period, I'd focus on the coaching points of the skill. These are, once receiving the ball, make sure the player's transferring the weight. So if the player is right-handed, they'll step forward with the opposite foot, so which would be the left foot. As they transfer the weight, they'd bring the elbow up, so they'd abduct the shoulder and flex the elbow. As they release the ball, they'd extend the elbow and flick the wrist, and make sure they follow through and point their follow through towards a player in which they want to receive the ball, or in the early practice towards the cross. By flicking the wrist, it's making sure that the ball does go towards the player and not wayward towards another player or off the side of the court.